なんだちゅうんじゃ。
バイバイ。
バイバイ、バイバイ。
Solamente e la fiamma è accesa già. Scappo resto tutto torno, chi lo sa.
Welcome back, DevGod here. Today we're going to be talking about the self-proclaimed best episode of Urusei Yatsura, episode 44, After You've Gone. So you may be wondering, why is After You've Gone the self-proclaimed best episode of Urusei Yatsura? Sure, it might be a fan favorite, but what makes it the proclaimed best episode of Urusei Yatsura? And well, for that, I'll point you to episode 194, also sometimes known as 193 and a half, because it's a very weird episode. So you see with anime and cartoons, especially some of the classic ones, you eventually get these episodes that kind of reuse animation. These are the flashback episodes, the basically the clip show episodes, I think as The Simpsons called them. So you have those kind of episodes, but then with this Grand Prix special that was near the end of Urusei Yatsura's run, they did something very unique. So instead of doing your traditional flashback recap episode, they actually did one of the first ever top 5 or top 10 lists in anime history. And not just top 10 lists on YouTube, no. They had pretty much the first 5 minutes of this special episode dedicated to a top 5, and we're not talking, or top 10, and we're not talking about top 10 of the writers and the staff members' favorite episodes that they've worked on. No. They went throughout every prefecture in Japan and interviewed, well, I shouldn't say interviewed, but surveyed fans of the show to get what the fan favorite, at least the fan favorite in Japan episodes were. And this one was with a majority the top #1 episode, and for good reason. It was literally such a good episode that they reused the entire animation of the episode, but basically just cut out the opening and ending theme, but basically reused the entire episode, and then called it 194, episode 194 / episode 193 Grand Prix Special. Reused the entire episode, and they just slapped in the 5-minute, 3-minute or so top 10s list at the beginning, and basically having Cherry and Kutatsu Neko say yeah, this is a pretty good episode, and our writers, yeah, they're kind of calling it a day, so we're just gonna replay this episode for you. No updated animation, no, no new music or anything, or no, additional scenes. They're just yeah, we'll just, replay this episode again. So you may be wondering, what made this such a popular episode in Japan that got this the #1 spot among Urusei Yatsura fans? And, what makes this episode hold up so great, even with today's standards of animation and anime? Well, I think it's, two important things. The first is pretty obvious, is that the storytelling, instead of focusing on the hero's journey, and other, writing tropes at the time, even with writing tropes within the Urusei Yatsura episodes, instead of going for hero's journey and something like that for the storytelling, it actually uses the stages of grief to make a very compelling story, very interesting story. And also I think this episode right here is a very important piece in Ataru and Lum's relationship development. And I think it's what these two reasons put together into one episode has made it very memorable and very good. But before I can review episode 44 and say how it's the best episode of this anime, I think I do have to go ahead and explain Ataru and Lum's relationship up to this point, and as well as explain what Urusei Yatsura is all about up until, this point. The whole idea behind Urusei Yatsura is it's saying oh, what if all these Japanese myths and legends were actually aliens from outer space, right? And what if these obnoxious aliens from outer space just came to Earth to harass this unlucky teenager named Ataru? So Ataru basically has to deal with all these supernatural beings, and you think it'd be like one of those animes where, oh, the main character is forced to deal with all this stuff, but no, because he does have bad luck, but I mean, at the same time, he's like this greedy, lustful, teenager, so it's like really funny seeing how he interacts with these different, like, supernatural events, and also, like, what antics Ataru gets up to, because Ataru will do, like, he'll be selfish, he'll try to, like, date all the women. He's basically like this entitled, like, brat that goes around just a bad person. Ataru's definitely like this anti-hero you secretly root for just because you want to see what crazy stuff he gets up to. But then eventually Lum shows up in the first episode. And then Lum is this alien princess who basically falls in love with Ataru. And she's the complete opposite of Ataru, where, like, Ataru is lusting after every single girl. Lum basically falls in love with him, thinks she's married to him, and basically she's there to, like, prevent him from dating all the other girls, and also to, like, love him, and, like, oh, darling, I love you, and all that good stuff. She's pretty good waifu. She can fly. She can, shoot electricity. She likes to electrocute, Ataru a lot. Some people say that Lum is kind of like, acts like a tsundere. At its core, it's definitely Ataru and Lum having to kind of like confront each other's feelings, these complete polar opposites basically mistake each other and kind of like force themselves to get married, but then eventually they slowly fall in love with each other. Now, Urusei Yatsura, I feel, some people think it's strictly a comedy anime, and other people think it definitely has like hints of romance sprinkled throughout it. I'm kind of in that former. I think if you're gonna watch Urusei Yatsura, like, the comedy is its strongest point, but also they have, like, serious episodes that really get into, like, how these characters think, how these characters, why the characters do the things that they do. But since this best episode, episode 44, specifically deals with Ataru and Lum's relationship, I think it is important to see, like, how their relationship has progressed up to this point. So, of course, at the start, you have Ataru and Shinobu, right? But Ataru is kind of like this lusting after people, and Shinobu kind of going along with him. She's technically his girlfriend, although she's more of just like a friend that pities him at the beginning of the series. But, they definitely do love each other to an extent. But then Lum comes with her military, and they do like the whole game of tag, right? But Ataru accidentally proposes to Lum, and they have to get married, because, it's basically Lum misunderstands, Shinobu is misunderstanding, and Ataru is just, he doesn't know how to explain himself.
な行為も許されるのだ。結婚じゃ。やりました。ついにやりました。偉大なる救世主、諸星あたる君、ついに地球を最終日にして守りに来ました。あまりにも。
With their relationship, not off to a good start. Like, definitely they have, like, a very good story set up, with Ataru and Lum being basically these foils for each other and having this whole, like, Ataru, Lum, and Shinobu love triangle going on. But it still feels forced, because at the end of the day, Lum is still a princess of this alien military. And, like, the first 2 episodes, everything was out of Ataru's control, basically. Now, sure, he kind of, like, acted lusting, and he was being greedy at points throughout the episode, and kind of, like, sure of himself. Basically, he was being an anti-hero, but still, everything was still out of his control, and he couldn't really control his bad luck for the first 2 episodes. But then more episodes happen, they kind of start talking with each other, and then Pitter Patter Christmas happens, the first full-length episode of Urusei Yatsura. So basically, it's this Christmas special, and there's these guys called, like, the Stormtroopers who, like, really don't like that Ataru and Lum are still a couple. They don't know, like, why they haven't broken up yet, because they thought it'd be inevitable that they would break up, but no, they're just, like, so, Ataru and Lum at this point are just kind of delusional, but also, like, perfect for each other in a way. It's very hard to explain. They're, like, perfect polar opposites. So they're still together, so the Lum Stormtroopers make this whole, like, what's it called? Like, this whole plan, right? This whole, like, master plan to get Ataru and Lum to break up. So what they plan is they create this, like, fake woman, this, like, they basically hire an actress to write Ataru a love letter and, like, stage this whole thing where, like, oh, Ataru's gonna, like, act up during this date. They don't even say, like, what he's gonna do. They just, like, imply, like, oh, yeah, Ataru's gonna act up on Christmas. The news station's Lum, they invite all these people to witness this date, this, like, train wreck of a date happen at this cafe to, like, basically break Lum's heart and force her to break up with Ataru and hopefully fall in love with, like, one of them. So it's like this whole conspiracy against Ataru and Lum. And then, you know, Lum kind of freaks out with this. She electrocutes him. And then for, like, one of the first time, electrocutions are not going to work. Supernatural bullshit is not going to work. Ataru is going through with this. Because, like, Ataru really wants to do this, and he's going to date this girl. But then Lum, you know, learns that the stormtroopers are planning this whole conspiracy, and then you really see that Lum is, like, thinking about, like, oh, what should I do? What should I do? Should I save Darling? Should I let this happen to Darling? Should I let this happen to Ataru? Does he deserve it? Does he not deserve it? And then she's like, you know what? I still love him, so I could leave if I really want to, but I'm gonna go save him. He needs to be saved. She basically electrocutes the actor, and then steals her clothes on Christmas. Yeah, so that's interesting. And then she basically goes in, she pretends that she's the actor that's supposed to, like, break up with Ataru and, like, embarrass him at the cafe. And then they have, like, this really cool heart-to-heart with, like, Christmas music and snow falling, and, like, they hold hands for the first time. And Ataru is actually, at the end, thinking to himself, like, wow, Lum is actually a really, like, nice person that just kind of saved me again. Pitter Patter Christmas is the point where they really start to, like, love each other with their own free will, and not just because all these wacky hijinks that are happening in the first, like, original episodes were happening to them. They're actually starting to kind of, like, choose to be around each other. And then it also showcased again in the great matchmaking operation where Ataru literally goes to another planet and gets cramped in this, like, duck robot to save Lum after he learns that her father's setting up this whole matchmaking session to, like, find her a new husbando to replace Ataru. And, you know, Ataru, although at this point it's still kind of, like, weird love, because Ataru isn't, he loves Lum at this point, but he's not really saving her because he loves her. He's saving her because if he loses Lum, then he's not going to be able to lust after other babes from space. So there is, like, ulterior motives, but, like, joins this whole matchmaking resistance force out of all these different aliens, and then he actually, you know, saves Lum. And of course everything resets the status quo, but, you know, Lum is basically like, oh yeah, Ataru loves me. And Ataru's trying to, like, play it off cool, like, oh yeah, you know, I was at Earth the whole time, because he was, like, wearing a disguise, but it's pretty obvious, like, everyone except Ataru, that everyone knew Ataru came to save Lum and, like, convince her dad that he was the best husbando for his waifu Lum. So yeah, that's basically how that episode ends. And then you get to this episode, the best episode in the series, After You're Gone. Okay, finally, without further ado, episode 44, After You've Gone, best episode of the series. So we start the episode out with Ataru and Lum basically kind of doing, like, slice-of-lifey vibes together. He's reading manga, she's, like, stitching a doll. And this doll, like, represents a lot, so we'll get back to the doll later. But Ataru, you know, he's reading this manga, and then they're having, like, a very subtle, like they're setting up their foreshadowing. They're like, oh, darling, we have to go to this, like, anniversary event. Because, it's apparently, you know, between episode 1 and episode 44, 1 year has passed between, like, the game of tag that, like, made Ataru and Lum basically accidentally marry each other. It's like 1 year has passed, and the Lum stormtroopers are, you know, scheduling this celebration. It's like, celebrate Lum, celebrate Ataru, quotation marks, but they really just, like, want to keep Lum happy, so that way, even if Ataru acts out, Lum still stays on Earth, basically. And then they have like a very subtle moment where Ataru's like reaching for food or something, and like Lum's like pushes the bowl of food so he can grab it. But like Ataru doesn't take notice of this because he's kind of like self-absorbed a little bit. So it's already like foreshadowing that like Ataru needs Lum, but he doesn't know it yet. And it's a very subtle way of showing it. I love that. There's a lot of like very subtle representations, very subtle what's it called? Like symbolization going on within this episode. Very good attention to details. So Ataru and Lum go to the cafe to like go to the Lum stormtroopers meeting. And then Lum is saying like how much fun she's had at Earth and thanking everyone. The Lum stormtroopers are saying like how wacky everything is, but how like much they love her and like wish Ataru and Lum good luck. But then of course Ataru being Ataru has to mess everything up, so Ataru is kind of being a little salty, right? And he's making very good points, but he is kind of like being stuck out about it. He's like, you know what? I've not had a good year, because I guess he's like, but Ataru's making these good points. He's like, I've been trapped for a whole year. I've not been able to date Shinobu. I haven't been able to date all the other women. I've been electrocuted on a daily basis. So many aliens I've come across have given me trouble, and I've had it. And basically, and then Lum, I guess, that is like kind of like one of the weaker parts of the episode, but it's a very small nitpick, is Lum is very like fly on the wall this episode. She doesn't really react that much. She's just like, oh, okay. But it definitely is really Ataru's story and Ataru's dependency on Lum that he doesn't understand. So he's saying like all these like mean things. And then eventually, Lum is really being sincere. Instead of, like, being delusional and, like, shocking him, Lum is actually, being very sincere and, like, hearing him out. And then Lum is basically eventually to the point where she's a little bit sad that he's, like, acting like this on their 1-year anniversary of meeting. And then Lum is finally, she's like, oh, darling, do you really want me to leave? And Ataru's like, yes. And then Lum's like, hey, darling. And Ataru's like, what? And then again, very subtle detail, but then she, like, wipes food off of his face, because I guess he has, like, a little bit of, like, food stuck on his lip or something, so she's wiping it off for him to, like, kind of try to subtly, show Ataru that he actually does need her. And then Ataru is just kind of being this, like, spoiled, like, oh, I can do it myself, grumpy grump. And then they have a they get to, like, the main point of the episode. Lum goes to the door, and the stormtroopers are just, like, watching this, terrified that they're, like, not going to see Lum again. And then Lum is basically like, hey, darling. And Ataru's like, what? And then she's literally like, bye-bye. And then Ataru is like, bye-bye, bye-bye, like, mocking her. And then she kind of, like, goes away.
Daddy?
なんだちゅうんじゃ。
バイバイ。
ベイベイ、ベイベイ。
Lum goes to Ataru's room, and she gets 10, her cousin, and then she leaves the doll that she was like working on, like the doll of herself, and she leaves that in Ataru's room. And then she's basically like, okay, doll, you'll have to take care of Ataru. And then she basically kind of leaves. Like, she leaves. She takes 10, she goes to her UFO, and of course there's more episodes, so like she comes back like once the status quo is basically restored at the end of the episode. But she really does leave, and they treat it very seriously, and it's a very quiet. And then we get on to the stages of grief within this episode. So like I said before, this episode is very unique in the fact that not only do like Ataru and Lum are at their best in this episode, by the way, but also the fact that instead of your traditional episode or story structure that uses the hero's journey, this one actually uses the stages of grief to tell its story as its story structure. So now that you have this whole premise set up of, Lum basically leaving Ataru, she divorces Ataru. That's why I'm naming this YouTube video, like, When Your Waifu Leaves You, because that's like, you have other episodes that basically, like, oh, Ataru finally gets what he wants. You have, like, a lot more, like, episodes and OVAs that kind of go that similar route, but this is definitely the one that's, like, really hits home just because they show Ataru during his stages of grief with Lum leaving. So, Ataru gets home from school, and Ataru is just assuming that, like, he's acted like this way before, but she's never really listened. So Ataru's just, like, thinking, like, oh, okay, Lum's just gonna come home, and she's gonna forget what I said because she loves me and I can do whatever I want. But then Ataru starts to get sad because he's like, here we go. So he is in stage 1 of grief, denial. Like, this is stage 1 of his character arc this episode, denial. So, he's under the impression that, like, oh, Lum is just going to be back at the house. And then she's not back at the house. And then, like, more things happen. He's like, oh, I bet, like, Lum is hiding in the closet, or she has some kind of recorder device planted in the room or something, or some secret camera that she's watching me with. Oh, her UFO is probably, like, right above the house. So he's basically going room to room and, like, checking all the rooms in this house. And he's not finding Lum anywhere. And he's starting to get, like, a little bit panicked. So he actually goes outside, like, to see if, like, Lum is anywhere to be found. So he starts, like, calling her out. And then he meets Cherry, which is, like, this priest guy. And then Cherry's basically like, did something happen between you and Lum? Basically representing Ataru's consciousness in a way. And then Ataru just kind of, like, goes home and thinks about what he's done. And he finds the doll. And then he, like, goes out to the balcony. And I'll just, like, play it right now. They have a very subtle moment, like, a very quiet moment, without any words being said, of Ataru just, like, standing out of his balcony, just, like, really, the reality of, like, the consequences of his action just, like, crushing him. Like, denial is breaking, and he's, like, starting to think, like, oh, shit. Lum might not be coming back because I was acting like a jerk.
Bye bye.
Lamu.
So Ataru was not able to sleep at all that night, because he had, like, that crushing realization. But then he starts to transition from denial into anger, right? So then, his classmates basically call him out because he is carrying the doll now in his pocket, and he's acting kind of, like, sad. So they're like, oh, wow, you really do love Lum. And of course, kind of, like, being the tsundere, like, character that Ataru is, he kind of denies it at first. But then eventually comes across Mendo, right? And Mendo is, like, oh, did Lum finally dump you? And then he officially, like, transitions into the rage. And then he has, like, this whole imagination segment where he's imagining basically Mendo, because Mendo's, like, this rich kid. He basically owns his own private army and everything. But Ataru has this whole dream segment, which the interesting thing about this dream segment is he's not imagining Lum going to Mendo because of Ataru's actions, but Ataru is still somewhat in denial, right? And that he's imagining that Mendo manipulated Lum into basically living at his mansion and being kidnapped. Not that Ataru did anything wrong. Ataru still is not, putting blame on himself yet. He's dejecting his blame while entering this, like, anger stage of grief and, like, projecting it onto Mendo. But then Mendo calls it out and is like, I've not seen Lum. They have, like, a really funny moment where they're, like, just slamming the desk with each other with Ataru and Mendo. It's just like,
ダムを返せ今返せすぐ返せ立ちどころに返せ瞬く間に返せあっという間に返せ返せ返せ返せ返せ返せ返せ僕がラムさんの居所を知ってるわけないだろないだろ
And then, anger kind of goes away pretty quickly. And then finally, Ataru and Mendo, which that probably took Ataru, like, a lot of bravery to do, because, like, Ataru and Mendo are kind of, like, rivals in a way. So for Ataru to ask for Mendo's help in locating Lum for him really says a lot about how much Ataru missed Lum, with the fact that he was willing to go to his rival for help locating her. So they have, like, this whole chase scene. Which, by the way, at this point, Ataru is actually in the bargaining phase, because he is willing to, still kind of in denial about his feelings, but he accepts that, like, Lum is gone. In denial about his responsibility and the fact that she left. So he basically convinces Mindo to send out his private army to go look for Lum. And then like they have like this pretty wacky, oh, we're searching around the world, but we're really bad at it joke. Like montage of searching for Lum. That's actually pretty funny, pretty well animated. And definitely needed because this is a very serious episode, so it's good that they had like that comedic scene in the middle of it to kind of like break up the vibes that this episode was giving off. So of course, they cannot find Lum. And then so basically bargaining is almost done. So like physical bargaining is done because like, okay, I'm gonna like bargain with Mindo. I'm gonna bargain with the stormtroopers and everyone that I know to try to find Lum. But like I'm still not at fault for Lum leaving. So he's still somewhat in denial, but he's definitely in the bargaining stage. And then now he thinks like, oh, okay, so now that Lum's gone, I can do whatever I want now. Because that's like what I've always wanted. So, I can, fall in love with Shinobu again and everything will be good. Like, everything's going to work out just right. So he's kind of like bargaining with himself at this point instead of bargaining with other people. So they have like a very amazing scene, right? Where Shinobu and Ataru are, at the park at night. And Ataru's like saying like, oh, we've had a lot of like crazy shenanigans this past year. But, Lum is finally gone and I am finally ready to talk about that marriage you promised me for saving the Earth. So you think everything's going to work out good. But then they have this like really like subtle thing where you can tell Ataru's like holding back his sadness. And then Shinobu calls him out for it. Like Shinobu at this point is like very reserved, very quiet. Up until now, Shinobu and Ataru's been this like love triangle that was kind of dying out, especially when Mindo was introduced and Shinobu fell more in love with Mindo. And I guess it went from a love triangle to like a love rectangular prism. So anyway, she basically is done with Ataru at this point and calls him out. She's like, oh, Ataru, you still have Lum's doll in your pocket. And Ataru's like, oh. And that's when, bargaining turns into depression for him. And then you really see it where, Shinobu's basically like, Ataru, I'm done with you. Is there anything else I can help you with? Like, help you with your feelings or anything? But, like, romantically, I'm just done with you, Ataru. And then Ataru's basically like, no, and he goes to the city. Which he never goes to again, but, oh my god, this, like, ending, like, insert song is done really good. So Ataru goes to this city at night. This, like, live city with a whole bunch of people, whole bunch of like events going on and like whole bunch of like lighting and stuff like that. And so much symbolism is in this scene. So you see like the lighting obstructs the people. So you see the people are having fun because they're actually with other people that they care about. But then Ataru's like goes to this town, I guess maybe as like a last effort to bargain with himself. But he goes to this town, he sees everyone just so happy. And he's just imagining, like, Lum in the sky. He's, like, not really finding anyone he can relate to. And he's, like, realizing that he threw away something really good. And he's, like, going around. He's, like, does weird facial expressions with this toy in a store. And plus, the insert song is Kokoro Bosuna. And if you ever look up the lyrics, it's basically one of the ending themes of Urusei Yatsura, but they use it in this episode as, like, the insert song to go into the background while Ataru's doing this sad little walk cycle through this vibrant city full of people having good times together. And it's basically, a song about like how Lum is threatening to say goodbye to Ataru because she's done with his bullshit. And like how like his actions, this is basically Lum calling out Ataru in a way with this song being like how Ataru's not going to find true love if he continues doing the actions that he does, and that's probably best for Lum to go away, but she still loves him. So then eventually gets, like, the climax where it goes, it's, like, throughout this song, you can tell he's slowly transitioning from, like, bargaining, thinking, like, oh, I'm gonna, like, get company at this city or, like, hit on some, like, women or something, to, like, full-on, like, in a gutter, well, I shouldn't say gutter, he basically trips and he falls in this back alley, he gets himself covered in, like, this gross garbage and, like, this fish skeleton, and then he's just, like, all out crying, he's like, oh my gosh, Lum, what have I done? Will you come back? I miss you. Why'd you have to leave? And he's basically like so regretful over like telling her to go bye-bye. He's like finally in the depression stage. He's like no longer bargaining for himself. He knows he was like acting. He knows his actions actually have consequences at this point, and he does not like those consequences in the thought of being without Lum and like not having that true love and going back to his like lusting, life that he had before, where he just like lusted for people instead of like actually wanting to love people in a way. So yeah, that's very interesting. And then the whole plot twist of the episode was that Ataru was actually right from the beginning, right? So Lum snuck a microphone in the doll she made, and that's like why, like, oh, the doll. She's stitching the doll, and Ataru is carrying the doll. And you think like the doll's gonna like represent, Ataru's like subtle, like subconscious want to be with Lum. Before she comes back to Earth, though, she cuts back to Ataru the next day. Again, he's not asleep the entire night. He basically slept in an alley. And he's going to school. His eyes are weird, and you can just tell by the way he's walking that, like, he is in complete acceptance.
Daddy. Daddy.
Returns to Earth. They have a good reunion. Ataru, by the way, is completely in the acceptance phase at this point. So he's gone from depression all night long to just kind of like acceptance. He knows like his actions were wrong. He knows he's probably not going to see Lum again because of the way he was acting. But then Lum returns because, of course, he had like reset to the status quo. So Lum was listening to the whole thing. So she knows that Ataru is like sorry for what he did, but Ataru doesn't know that Lum knows that. So, of course, Ataru goes back to trying to play like the cool guy. He's like, oh, yeah, I knew you'd come back. It's about time you came back. And then Lum kind of calls him out. She's like, oh, darling, I'm glad that you kept my doll in your pocket that I left you. And then, of course, like, everyone's happy she came back. And then Ataru breaths a sigh of relief. And yeah, that was Urusei Yatsura After You're Gone. They roll the credits and then reset to the status quo. So yeah, I really, if you could not tell, I really do love this episode of Urusei Yatsura a lot. And it's pretty obvious why this is a fan favorite among, like, fans of Urusei Yatsura, and why it's even canonically the best episode of Urusei Yatsura, according to that one TV special. It's just a very interesting look in how Lum thinks, and a very interesting look in how Ataru thinks about their relationship, about everything that's, like, happened to them. And plus, this is, like, one of the only times where they actually kind of, like, reflect on their past, because, the whole plot behind this episode is, like, where all the other episodes are, like, episodic in nature, everything returns to the status quo for the most part. This episode really, tackled history, because they're like, oh, it's been a year since the events of the first episode. How do we feel about each other? How do we see each other? And you really, there's so many subtle moments where you see Ataru needs Lum, and you see, like, why Lum, like, what Lum sees in Ataru. Because Ataru is still this anti-hero, but he still also has a lot of redeeming traits that are kind of hard to see at first, but then when you really start to understand him, you really see what Ataru is all about, and, like, why Lum is obsessed with him. And plus, finally it does put the whole Ataru, Lum, Mendo, Shinobu love rectangle, it kind of, like, retires that, because at this point, Shinobu's finally kind of done with Ataru. So, like, the last bit of the relationship being that, like, people thought Ataru and Shinobu should have stayed together. Well, this episode's pretty obvious that both of them, for different reasons, are done with each other, and they have a very, quiet, subtle moment about that at the end, so they kind of put that to rest. So in that way, the rest of the series can really focus on Ataru and Lum and, like, all the shenanigans they can get to. So yeah, really good storytelling. And also, like, really good animation. I love the cafe scene, like, with all the bloom effects that they do. And the fact that there's so many, like, references to previous episodes in this episode. So they reference that it's been a year since the first episode. They also reference that that was the same cafe that, in Pitter Patter Christmas, where Lum and Ataru almost broke up because Ataru fell in love with a actor that the Stormtroopers hired. and that whole, master plan was foiled in that cafe. You even have like a quick reference by Megane, like, oh, Lum might be on another matchmaking operation, referencing that episode. So really, the writer of this episode, Momoro Oshii, really knew like the important episodes of Urusei Yatsura up to this point that explored Ataru and Lum's relationship, and in return he was able to like show the development of their relationship and they themselves as characters in a very interesting way. One being that, of course, instead of using the traditional hero's journey, he used the stages of grief as a storytelling tool, but also the fact that he knew the previous episodes and that the direction to take the characters. And plus, he's just well known for writing those kind of like, stories that explore those characters. I also really like that while it is definitely a Ataru themed episode, other people like Mendo and the Stormtroopers and Lum and her parents really, get a say in like what their relationship is like. So you get the Stormtroopers like, kind of happy that she's still there, but surprised that they're still a couple and they haven't broken up yet. And then you have like Mendo, who just like thinks she's like in love with Lum, but also respects that she loves Ataru, even though he and Ataru are rivals. You have like that really cool dynamic between Mendo, Ataru, and Lum. You even have like Ten like wondering like, oh, why do you put up with Ataru? And like Lum's father like wondering like, yeah, I know you told me that like you're in love with Ataru, but are you sure you do not want another matchmaking operation? Are you really sure that Ataru loves you and that you should stay like on Earth with him? Do you think this relationship's working out? Like, what's up? So not only does this episode explore Ataru and Lum's relationship really good, but it also really explores the other characters' reaction to their relationship. So it's a very fun watch. I highly recommend it to any anime fans. Plus, it's like one of those special Urusei Yatsura episodes that get really deep, while at the same time like having a lot of fun like sci-fi moments, having a lot of fun comedy moments, even like really good animation moments for 1980s animation standards go. So yeah, I'd like rate this like a 100 star out of a 100 star. Very good episode. Very interesting look in grief and the effects of grief that grief has on people, as well as like how people don't always realize that they depend on other people, and it really makes you like think about those feelings of grief and dependency and relationships. So yeah, highly recommend it. Make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to comment down below. What do you guys think about Urusei Yatsura after you're gone? Or maybe you guys have a completely different favorite episode of Urusei Yatsura that you want me to do a full review on. Anyway, see you guys next time. Peace.